Let's see. Well, my in-laws are in town, so that's fun. They're over here. Say hello if you haven't met them yet. Just during the reading of the psalm and during the worship times, I was kind of like, okay, God, thank you for encouraging me and reminding me that the stuff that I'm going to be sharing this morning is not just my own creation or my own thoughts, because there's a portion of it that was covered in a few different ways. I'll just jump to these real quick. So in Psalm 107, they're like on a stormy sea, and then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet. And one of the biggest things I want to do this morning is just like figure out how to help us be people that God is enlightening, like to see him more clearly, to see him more accurately, and just to be able to like glorify Jesus some more. And this thing is in the Psalms probably 2,000 years or so before Jesus is alive, and in the passage I'm going to be reading from, he does the same thing with his voice. He tells the storm like peace and quiet, and it's all still. I'm like, oh man, there's one more that I wasn't aware of until this morning, where he's talked about and he does the things that are prophesied about thousands of years before he was born and started doing his ministry. So let's see. Let me pray, and then we'll start looking at Mark 5. So Jesus, I just ask that that your words are what's being spoken this morning, and that all of us have ears to hear, that your word falls on ears that will hear and respond to what you have to say, and that we can be comforted and encouraged and see more clearly, and that you be glorified because of that. In Jesus' name, amen. So, actually, I think this was sometime last week where Joe was like, this is my favorite style of teaching. Tell him what you're going to tell him, and then tell him what you told him. So, first things first, we're going to talk through a little bit about the parable of the sower and the seeds. That one might be something for you all to chew on, or for each of us to chew on in our own time. Jesus and the demoniac that he heals, the one with the legion of demons. And then I think the emphasis, I want that to be on two different people that we'll come across and how their suffering impacts the way that they would, quote unquote, pray. And Jesus' character kind of like woven in through all of this. So, let's see. So if we go to Mark 5, actually I'll start previewing Mark 4. Jesus is on one side of the sea, and he's done all this teaching through different parables, and confuses some people, clarifies things for some others, and then he hops across the sea real quick, does some ministry to one demon-possessed guy, kills thousands of pigs, incidentally, with the demons that he casts out, and then he leaves the guy behind, and he goes back to the other side of the sea, and that's where the bulk of this occurs, that I want to speak on. But if we go back to the part, this is in Mark 4. Jesus is speaking to people in parables. So I'm going to start in verse 13. And Jesus is teaching big crowds and people from various levels of interest and all that stuff. Some people are just there to see some spiritual guy, and some others are like, this is a man from God, and I want to know more. So he teaches this parable about the sower of seeds, and the disciples, they're asking him questions about this afterwards. So this is where verse 13 picks up. And he said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word, and these are the ones along the path, where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on the rocky ground, the ones who, when they heard the word, they immediately received it with joy. and they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on the account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are the ones sown among thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires of things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. But those that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. I'm glad that's me. Just kidding. I think it's always safe to assume that we are never the best case scenario in any of these stories. I think personally, and this is where the invitation is to dig into this parable, because Jesus actually refers to this almost as a key to understand every other parable. He says, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" So, verse 19: the cares of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, the desires for things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. And like, I work as a missionary and get to travel all these places and share as often as possible about the word. And I still see in my own life, there's like thorns that grow up and they start to prevent fruitfulness in my life. And I would love to be able to just assume and roll forward with like, yes, I'm seeing 30, 60, 100-fold multiplication and produce in my life, but at a honest evaluation, that's not exactly what I see. And I don't want to be discouraged by that or discourage anybody here by that. But the one where it's being choked out by the thorns, it's not dead yet. It still has life in it, and there's pruning that happens and cleaning out the garden, all the weeds, all the thorns and the thistle. So just want to encourage with that. Remember that passage, it's in Mark 4, and just look at it and ask the Lord about what's going on with cares, desires, worries, and things in the world, because like produce is refreshing. Produce like gives life to other things, and it's honoring and glorifying to Him, and it's just evidence of revitalizing life that we have with Him. And like that's something I want more of, and for this congregation too. I want to see all of us be able to, whether it's 30, go to 60. If it's 60, go to 100. If it's 100, just bask in the fact that Jesus is so honored by that produce in your life. So there's one little piece. Let's see. Now we get to hop back to the other side of the sea where Jesus interacts with this demon-possessed guy. Yeah, that's on the way there. That's where we get the passage about Jesus calming the storm. I was like, oh, that's so cool. Like, here's the prophecy lived out. They're like, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" Because he's just asleep on the boat and totally calm and at ease. And he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And this is after, I think, one of the feeding of the several thousand. And but they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who is this then that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And this morning was the first time I realized they might be thinking back to this psalm and realizing, like, we thought he was a great guy, but he is like way more than just that. It's like starting to sink in. Like, we might actually be in the presence of God, and we just said, "Don't you care whether we live or die?" To him. Like, check yourself. So they go to the other side. They survive the storm because Jesus is with them. And they come to the other side of the sea where the Gerasenes are. They're Gentiles. And I'm sure the disciples were like, "What are we doing here? They're not the people of God. Why are we wasting our time?" And they come up to this guy who's just totally like overrun by demons. Chains, like metal chains, can't hold him back. And he breaks through those things. He's naked. He cuts himself. He's harming himself, harming other people, freaking everybody out. And he lives in a cemetery. He lives in a place of death. And it's like, it's discouraging. It's brutal. He's totally stripped of all dignity. And long story short, Jesus spends some brief time with him, rebukes the demons, gives them permission to go into the pigs instead of going to like the dry place, wherever that is. And all those things commit suicide. And then by the time the guys who are watching over all those pigs come back and realize, like, our whole flock is dead. Like, our livelihood is gone. They see this guy who's been otherwise running around naked and full of demons, sitting clothed in his right mind at the feet of Jesus, and they're terrified. These two, the two guys who take care of the pigs, they're terrified by this. But this is something that I heard pointed out recently that was really strange. Or not really strange. This idea is strange though, at first glance, where the guy's like, "Can I please come with you?" And Jesus tells him, "No, stay here." And he's got no pastor, no teacher, no other Christian friends, and he's just entered into this new life because of Christ. And Jesus says, "No, stay here and testify." So we got, I think one thing at work is God's Spirit obviously keeping this man, keeping his faith, but also he's being active at a command of Jesus. He's being active with his faith, and that is to share the testimony of what's been changed in his life with everybody around this whole area of the Gerasenes. And that is anchoring him closer and closer and closer and closer to Christ. And there's no doubt he went through an immense amount of suffering because of, it doesn't say how many years, but because of the presumed years that he spent totally possessed by these spirits. So here's one of his pieces about the character of Jesus. He's not being brutal, he's not being cold. He's actually doing something that's going to build up this guy's faith in his relationship. Also, he totally restores dignity to somebody who was like I said, he had none. He had no dignity, he had no home, no place among any people, and Jesus gave him all of that back and a commission and a ministry. So if there's one little tiny takeaway nugget, you're never too far gone. Immediately, the same day, this guy is sent out into ministry. And I forget what passage it's in, but they come back a little bit later to the opposite side of the sea after they go back one more time. They go back to this area of the Gerasenes, and it is ready for the gospel. No doubt because this guy was running around telling every person, or people just witnessing the fact that he's in his right mind and he's been changed. And he's accrediting that to the work of Jesus in his life. So Jesus leaves behind a witness who speaks the local language, who knows the local customs, who knows the people, the places. He knows all these things. And there are seeds sown for the sake of the gospel that are able to be harvested later. So pretty soon after that, they have this really brief exchange, and Jesus says, "Just stick around and share." And he's got one foot in the boat pretty much, and tells the guy, "You can't come with us." Gets in the boat, goes across, back to the area where he was sharing the confusing parables with everybody else. So this is where this is the good stuff and the hard stuff. So we get to see two categories of people: the privileged people and the destitute people, all in this next little section. And like I said at the very beginning, there's two different, what I'll call prayers, that kind of come from each person's situation. So the privileged and the destitute, they both have these circumstances where there's just some aspect, some degree of suffering that's going on, and prayer is born from their suffering. They have this reaction. There's so many options of how to respond when we're in the midst of suffering. So one of them, this guy Jairus, his prayer looks like running to Jesus and pleading. And the woman who's been afflicted with bleeding for 12 years, hers is this quiet approach, and she just subtly grasps the hem of Jesus' robe. She doesn't even speak a word. And she tries to do it in private, in secret, even though it's in a packed crowd. So one is full of this intense action, running, and a thorough request, and the other is just this quiet, just laying on of a hand to see what Jesus will do just by being who he is. So yes, suffering. So we're going to talk about for a little bit, and you can't. I can't really think of talking about suffering without talking about where Jesus is in suffering. So this will be good. And I do want to point out, though, there's a lot to say about Jesus and his suffering, but, like, let's see. There's obedience to the point of suffering that he was taught. As a son of God, he was taught obedience through suffering. He was also suffering through his sacrifice. He was suffering to fulfill different prophecies. And there's suffering to talk about because of where we can have fellowship with him because of our suffering, which talks about him in some regard, but it also talks about what we can do to engage with Jesus. So there's suffering that comes from, like, self-inflicted stuff, like our own sins. There's suffering that comes from, like, life is just hard, and Jesus says it's full of troubles. And there's also suffering that comes from not backing down from our witness to Jesus. But I'm going to point out an interesting fact as we start reading this passage. This will be in chapter 5, starting in verse 21. This first guy, Jairus, his name means God enlightens. And I think there is a lot to grasp from that, because we only know this much about him. So let me start reading here, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. So Jairus is a synagogue leader. He's well respected in the community. We have no reason to believe he should have any other ideology, like, different from any of the other Pharisees we've met so far. He would probably have seen Jesus as a heretic. He would probably think he's protecting the people by preventing them from hearing anything from Jesus. It would look weird, but he'd be concerned about the state of the people, and he also just wants Jesus to not be spreading false things, because in his mind, that's what he likely would have understood. However, instead of kind of falling prey to all the ideology and, like, no, there is this strict way, it's the way of the tradition of the Jews instead of what God's word has actually been speaking to us through these old books that Moses wrote and that we're studying. His suffering is a bulldozer that just moves everything out of the way. He's got all these barricades and all these barriers of why he should never talk to Jesus except to say, "Never open your mouth in my town ever," or "You're not allowed to speak in my synagogue." Anything like that would have been the only exchange that we'd expect to hear from somebody like Jairus to Jesus, until he's at this point where he's like, "My little daughter is at the point of death." And he's heard these stories of other people being healed. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And Jesus goes with him. So he's like, Jesus is a heretic. I won't get caught up with the one who draws mindless crowds. Like, he only attracts the people who don't think well. Or he wants to take a stand for what Israel stands for, and groveling before some self-proclaimed man, like deity man, that's not what we do as Israel. We only bow to God. And, like, so many excuses, on and on and on, until his daughter is at the point of death. Which, at face value, that's a terrible thing. That's a terrible suffering to go through. People who are ill, which we've had in this congregation, people who have been lost. But it was his great need, it was his fear, it was his suffering that pushed every obstacle out of the way between him and Jesus. And Jesus is faithful to use those kinds of things. So the story jumps to the woman. So Jesus goes with him, and they're in the middle of this great crowd trying to work their way through. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him, starting in verse 25. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garment, I will be made well." So this touching, even the fact that she's in a crowd like that, if you've ever read Leviticus and all the bodily fluid stuff, you know that that is a big no-no. She should not have been anywhere around there. It would have been a stretch for her even to be around the physicians, and she definitely should not have touched some like holy man, priest, prophet, anything like that, because the idea is that she would have tainted or stained or made unclean the person that she touches. But she's 12 years of this slow burn suffering. It's just like accumulating and getting worse the whole time. Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" He's so keenly aware. Like, it's not, I felt a little like ripple in my shirt. It's like he was aware that power went out from him. And his disciples said to him, "You see, the crowds are pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" It's like there's no reason somebody didn't touch you. It's packed in here. Yet you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So before we get too far past that, like I said, 12 years. That's a crazy long time to have some kind of ailment or disease that, in effect, makes her a social outcast. Because of that, she's not allowed to be around people, and she's starved for like human interaction. And then she gets this little glimmer of hope after so many years. Once Jesus' ministry had started, there's this man who, like, he's walking around and he's healing people. People come to him with diseases, with sickness, with demons, and he can do something about it, and he does do something about it. So it's like that a little spark, a little ember starts to glow, and she's like, this faith is stirred, but she's still terrified, and she spent everything she has, and it hasn't worked. And this suffering has just like readied her for this point of this interaction with Jesus, of meeting him in a way that nobody else can, frankly, because they haven't suffered quite like she has. So a couple things to point out about that. It's like sometimes we have this fear that with our sickness or with our whatever we have as suffering, if we come up to Jesus, we're going to touch him and like stain his white robes. She's the one who's broken, and he's the one who's whole. When she touches him, she doesn't spread the brokenness. She gets healed by a touch with him who's completely whole. She's the one who's unclean, and she touches him who is white as snow, and she doesn't stain his garments. She gets cleansed because of that interaction. He's not intimidated by our grief. He's not intimidated by our gross, and that's kind of this like prayer that I see that she's kind of living out. She's praying this slow, quiet, I've been agonizing for this much time. This could cost him everything, but I'm going to reach out and touch him. And she gets changed instead. So, continuing with the story, we're back with Jairus. So all this is going on. It takes a little bit of a delay. And I don't think it's a delay that really counts for long enough that would have made a difference in Jairus' daughter's life. But verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" It's like, man, if it wasn't bad enough, he realizes his daughter is at the brink of death. He hears about this guy back on his side of the sea. And it's him who goes. He doesn't even send servants like some other people have done in other stories in Scripture. Like Jairus, he's the one who runs out to Jesus, and he's like, maybe there's hope. And then he gets this message after. It's like, takes this surge up. Jesus is coming with him. He said yes. And then he gets the news from some of his servants. It's like, your daughter is dead. Why trouble him any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, he said to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." I think that is a word for us as Christians at all times. Just like, Does a circumstance seem dire? Don't fear. Only believe. It's rarely ever going to look exactly like we think it will, but Jesus is trustworthy. He's faithful. He's active. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and he went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. And here's a bonus: the woman was suffering for 12 years. The girl is 12 years old. I don't know if there's any connection, but you can stew on that one for a little bit. So, and at the same day, their various afflictions, well, Jairus' affliction, his daughters, at the same time, those are healed and restored. But Jairus' name, God enlightens, the one whom God enlightens. And this enlightening comes because he loses his daughter. Or at the very least, he thinks he's going to lose her for enough time where he's like, this is urgent, I need to find a miracle. And like that thing I mentioned before, there's fellowship with Jesus in his sufferings. So when we suffer in the ways that he does, when we are just suffering, if it's not like I sinned in some way and there's repercussions of that, like he still meets us in those places, but when they're suffering either for his name's sake or just because like we have frail human bodies, we're finite, and things start to happen, or somebody else's sin happens against us, that's a place to have fellowship with Jesus in his suffering. He was unjustly abused. His body was not able to recover as he's being destroyed and beat and mocked and scorned. Even his emotions and his emotions are taking a toll because of the shame and like spitting on him and mocking him. But that is a place to meet Jesus. And I heard a pastor years ago say there are certain chambers of Jesus' heart that only certain people can get into because of the amount that they've suffered. And I don't necessarily want to just welcome all the suffering, but I want to count every ounce of suffering that I've gone through as like something that opens new doors into my relationship with Jesus and my ability to understand him and know him, because he has suffered ultimately. And there is glimpses into that every time we go through something like this. So a question that I see raised is like, how do we see Jesus? Do we see him as somebody that we touch and we get him dirty instead of like a touch from him, whether it's me reaching out or him reaching out, that restores me? Or do we see him like, I'm so tired of you being sick all the time, and like we make a request over and over again, like do we hear him getting tired of us or bothered by us? Like, is that actually Jesus if we hear him doing that? It's like, I don't think so. Was he bothered by their needs? No. Was he inconvenienced to help either of them? No. There's a book that Sam actually gave me really recently called Gentle and Lowly, and the guy writing it is just trying to dive into who is Jesus? What's some of his most defining characteristics? And Matthew 11, 29 and 30. Let me read these. Actually, a little bit before that. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So the two things, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, the guy writing it, he uses this phrase, like he phrases it like this. something along the lines of like, the yoke is a not yoke with Jesus, and the burden is a not burden with Jesus. And Jesus describes himself, I am gentle and lowly. And in another translation, he says humble of heart instead of lowly. And I'm trying to filter through these different reactions that play through in my head of like projections of either how I respond or how different people in my life have responded to a need or a loss or a circumstance. Like trying to filter those thoughts, which are very much not his characteristics, through I am gentle and humble of heart. Like, yeah, I like picture you wrong sometimes, Jesus. Or I approach you expecting like the reaction instead of an embrace and like I understand, come here. So he's always better than we think he is. Jesus is always better than the best we can imagine. And like evangelism, part of what we talk about with different teachings, different teachers that come through our schools that we have at the YWAM base, they'll teach on evangelism and they'll talk about how it's like you're just correcting incorrect thoughts about who God is in people's hearts and minds. It's like until they can see him more and more accurately, of course there's going to be barricades and barriers and walls. And they might be the ones building them, keeping them, because they've just heard so many incorrect things or interpreted incorrectly about Jesus. And we as Christians, we still need to keep a accurate and a real and a fresh picture of who Jesus is, so that we don't start approaching him with like this really shy, what if he hits me this time instead of blesses me? You know? Like we can't approach him with that kind of attitude. I mean, we can, and he still is there. He's still the same as he is, but we're only crippling ourselves when we do that. So, who is Jesus really? There's Matthew 11 summarizes it, I think, in such a beautiful way. He talks about how he and the Father reveal each other, and like they really know each other, and people can know the Father because of who Jesus is. So he's welcoming, he's invitational. He has the power to like expose truth and to reveal who God is to people. He is gentle. He's not brutal, he's not blunt. I mean, he is those things, but never without gentleness. And he's humble in heart, he's lowly. He doesn't lord himself over people like the Gentiles do. He makes himself a servant and a slave to all. And like I think that can change our action or our reaction to trials or to adversity. It's like, am I going to run to him or am I going to hide from him? It's like, I want to run to him every time. And I want that for all of us here who get to hear this and spend time in Matthew or spend time even in those Psalms where it's like, oh my gosh, like I remember that story where he calms and quiets the sea with his words. And that was prophesied about. I didn't realize it was a prophecy. I thought it was just poetic writing. And there it is, the exact same thing happens. Like he's big, he's powerful.